It's the Security Weekly News, and it's episode 342. I'm Doug White, and welcome to the week of 12 November 2023. We've got Cybertruck, Solarwinds, Bitcoin, Docker, Ducktail, Experion, more news, and Jason Wood on this edition of the Security Weekly News.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week. Your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for the Security Weekly News. AI, accelerated cloud adoption, and hybrid work are fundamentally shifting how business gets done. The old way of securing your people, apps, and data doesn't work and scale anymore. To stay ahead, today's organizations need to reimagine their security and networking infrastructure with a cloud-first, unified SASE architecture. Join Palo Alto Networks and leading technologists from across the globe for SASE Converge 2023, a two-day virtual experience, November 15th and 16th. Revealing how SASE powered by advanced AI can drive better security and networking outcomes. Register today at securityweekly.com/Palo Alto.
Make sure you subscribe to the Below the Surface podcast by Eclipsium in partnership with CRA. Myself and Scott Shefferman host this show, and we've had the pleasure of speaking with some amazing guests, including Zeno Kova, Richard Hughes, Vincent Zimmer, and more. We discuss topics related to firmware and supply chain security, uncovering those pesky vulnerabilities that lie, well, below the surface in your environments. You can find all the episodes and subscribe by visiting eclipsium.com/podcast or searching for Below the Surface in your favorite podcast catcher.
All right, it's the Security Weekly News. I'm Doug White. Thanks to Glue Bar, who hosted my speech last night and gave me lots of free drinks. So the speech got a little loopy, but, hey, the drinks were good. So if you're ever on Ives Street in Providence, go by and check them out. That's a pretty interesting new little location. The Secretary of the Treasury in the United States, Janet Yellen, said that a ransomware attack which targeted the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China Financial Services and forced that bank, which is one of the largest banks in China, forced them to take some of the systems offline. There was a lot of people chattering about this in the financial markets, but Janet Yellen said that it caused only a minimal disruption to the U.S. Treasury market. Now, a minimal disruption to the U.S. Treasury market is still pretty scary in and of itself, but they said it was minimal. The impacted unit of the bank handles trades and other services for financial institutions, and this is basically one of those integrated kind of things where that bank and all these other banks do exchanges of information and they exchange trades and so forth. The Chinese website said that an attack last week forced it to disconnect and isolate affected systems to limit the impact from the attack. Now, U.S. and Chinese officials then met in San Francisco this week to discuss the impact of the attack on global markets. Now, as of August, China held $805.4 billion with a B dollars in U.S. Treasury securities. Yeah. And but that's the second largest holder of U.S. debt. Japan is the largest holder of U.S. debt. So basically, they can make us do whatever they want because they own all that debt. If they start dumping it, it causes mass chaos. But it was pretty scary when a bank that's managing all this stuff starts getting impacted by ransomware, and that has the potential to affect the U.S. markets and so forth. There were very few details of the attack, as you might guess, being released by the bank. But they did say in the report that the attack was by Lockbit. And if you're not familiar, Lockbit is a well-known Russian-speaking ransomware gang. And their policy is they don't target Russia or other former Soviet countries. And Lockbit's a very efficient ransomware tool, and they've attacked thousands of organizations since being noticed in September of 2019. So a pretty scary thing. Probably didn't make a lot of Chinese people very happy with Russia. But, hey, that's the way the news goes, right? Well, the recent charges against CISO Timothy Brown of Solarwinds by the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States is a kind of alarm bell. It rings with a deep, ominous tone, maybe a B flat, like Yeah, that kind of thing. So the complaint against the CISO focuses on violations of anti-fraud provisions of the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which probably didn't have a lot to say about cybersecurity, but nevertheless have a lot to say about fraud. That was written during the Great Depression after, the roaring 20s when there was a lot of fraud. So, yeah. The claim by the Securities Exchange Commission is that the CISO overstated the company's cybersecurity practices and failed to disclose known risks, which led to investors being misled. So the point is, the iron bell tolling across the hills, calling the faithful to their knees, means that CISOs are probably going to have to start developing better documentation methods to make sure they can illustrate the cyber capabilities and sign off on that. Because if that case actually succeeds against the CISO, it's going to have a massive impact on other CISOs who are always signing off on these things. And when I used to audit them and I ask questions like, do you lock your doors? Of course we do, Doug. And I go check the door and I go, it seems unlocked. And they go, well, most of the time we lock the door. And then I come back at 3 o'clock in the morning and the door is still unlocked. I mean, I saw that over and over again. I asked people, do you have, separate logins for all your different administrators? Oh, of course. And then you go look at it and go, there's just one here. They're all root. Oh, well, most of the time, and that kind of stuff. And that's where you get in trouble. I mean, I don't know what I think about this case being brought up and, and accusing this person of fraud, but it does imply that under a wide range of acts and such, you, the CISO or other security people may end up getting held liable if you sign off and say, we do these things, even if you actually do them, but especially if you can't do them or you don't do them or you can't prove that you do them. So there's a lot of issues there that, I think are going to be a big thing. I mean, it's really, really easy to check that box that says control in place. But then when an auditor tests it, which you should be doing, I found a lot of times the box was checked, but they weren't doing it. They just said they were doing it. And I mean, I found more than a few lies that were signed off. Anyway, my old adage of always be deposing, which means, always be thinking about when you're under oath and they're asking you that question, like, did you sign this? Be sure you're thinking about that when you sign things, because that's going to be a tough spot. I mean, just saying, I think we checked the fire extinguishers, I mean, that may cut it in keeping you off of the fraud list, but it's not going to get your controls in place. So if you say we checked the fire extinguishers and you didn't check the fire extinguishers and you didn't document checking the fire extinguishers, somebody can sue you for fraud and the Securities and Exchange Commission can bring charges against you. So don't sign stuff without reading and make sure your controls are actually in place before you say they are. Now, I love Docker. I really do. I mean, it's a great tool. It's fun. It's useful, and on and on. And I love introducing students to it and showing them. And I just the other day had a student say, "Wow, Docker was just really cool." But attackers are exploiting a misconfiguration in the Docker Engine API, which allows delivery of a Docker container called Oracle 4 or Oracle IV. I don't know how they want you to pronounce it. Maybe it's like something you put in your arm. I'm not sure, but Oracle IV, which is 4 in Roman numerals. But it's a distributed denial of service bot agent, despite the name. Cato Security Labs said yesterday that Oracle IV is named this because it's built from a base image called Oracle IV_latest, which contains Python-based malware compiled as an executable and a linkable format file. Now, Cato said that this should concern any organization which uses Docker in production, especially Docker Engine API. Cato threat research lead Matt Muir said, quote, usage of this API is common in cloud-native and microservice-driven architectures. So we urge security teams tasked with monitoring this technology stack to pay particular attention to securing the Docker host. And in common with similar web-facing services like Jupyter and Redis, it's highly recommended that firewalls and security groups are used to prevent unauthorized access to the API. Scott Gerlich, the CSO at Stackhawk, said that Oracle IV shows why security and DevOps teams need to work more closely together. Now, I mean, these kind of environments are complex. I mean, they start off simple and they seem pretty easy to deal with, but then you start putting them in the cloud and you start messing with them and you start adding to them, and over time, it gets pretty squirrely, and you got this outward-facing stuff that's got the whole world able to see it. It takes a lot of understanding on both the DevOps side and the SecOps side in order to understand this and deploy it without risk. So if you're using these environments or planning to use the environments, make sure you take proper precautions. Ducktail, which I think is based in Vietnam, is a malware group that is targeting marketing professionals in the fashion industry in their latest campaign. The attackers basically send out archives which contain images of authentic products from well-known companies with a malware executable that's all camouflaged as a PDF file. Kaspersky said that when the file is executed, the malware opens a genuine PDF that has detailed job information that's designed to appeal to marketing professionals who are actively seeking career change, which is probably all of them. You see a great job offer pop-ups. I mean, we all get these. I hope you all get them. I get them occasionally. Somebody sends me some, says, hey, are you interested in working for us? Here's an offer. And obviously, if it's malware-oriented, it would be a really great offer, and you'd probably want to click on it. But once you do click on it, while you're reading this great offer, the malware installs a browser extension which can exfiltrate your Facebook business and ad accounts. The likely intent, according to Kaspersky, is the sale of the stolen credentials. So regardless of your industry, you might want to review this stuff about opening files at work especially, because this obviously could contain just about anything. And even though this is an identity theft one, there's no reason they couldn't use this same technique to do all sorts of nasty things and or ransomware. So you might want to review your endpoint security. You might want to review your materials that you provide your employees about opening PDFs and so forth, just to give them, keep them up on that. Well, speaking of lawsuits, Intel is the subject of a class action lawsuit that was filed this week. A class action lawsuit, if you're not familiar with the term, consolidates all the claimants into one case. So you see these often with large, like product things and stuff like that. So the law firm goes out and they say, were you, and you've probably received these notices before, did you suffer harm due to, whatever, and join the class action. Now, you always have the right to sue individually, but then you have to get an attorney and so on. And so the class action suits appeal to attorneys because they consolidate all the settlements together into one giant thing and take 30% of it or something. But basically, the suit was filed in the Northern District of California in the United States, and alleging in the suit that Intel knew about the faulty instructions which enabled the downfall vulnerability, and that they not only knew about it, they knew about it for decades before actually releasing a fix. Now, the case is very complicated because there's a lot of implications for responsibility and what did they know and who knew what when and how did they know it and what did they do about it and what were they obligated to do about it and so on and so on and so on, particularly for manufacturers of things like chips. Now, if you recall, there's a classic business case about a car called a Ford Pinto. And the Ford Pinto exploded if you hit it just right because of a flawed design in the fuel filler. And so if somebody hit it from behind, it had the very big potential to burst into flames. And I actually knew someone who had just that experience and was horribly burned with a Ford Pinto when it got rear-ended and like on some ice. But Ford knew about it. I mean, they knew about it all along, and they knew these problems were happening, and they decided, of course, the business case about, they decided it was cheaper to pay the victims' claims in lawsuits than it was to fix the issue, So, boy, that's pretty ruthless, but regardless of that, that's what they did. Now, if you don't recall, downfall was a medium severity disclosure vulnerability in the 6th through 11th generations of CPUs made by Intel. And a Google researcher then demonstrated this vulnerability back at Black Hat in August. So now this is one of those fairly esoteric exploits. It only scored a 6.5, and the conditions for it to actually operate is a very narrow band of conditions involving certain situations and so forth. But it's a very interesting question regardless. I mean, are they responsible for this and any damages that may have occurred? Because if you are running an Intel processor, you may have thought, I may need to replace this. And that means you replace the motherboard and you have to replace a whole bunch of other stuff because Intel wasn't fixing it. So if you were concerned about it, you may well needed to have replace this. And that's not cheap when you start multiplying it times the number of Intel processors across any given company in the world. Now, Intel did patch this, which was almost damning in and of itself. As soon as it was pointed out in public, they immediately patched it. But the patch reduces your processing speeds to such a degree that you're basically left with a defective CPU. So it's kind of like Ford fixing the Pinto and saying, yeah, we fixed it, but now it doesn't actually work anymore. the car only goes 10 miles per hour or something. And the CPUs were so slow that nobody wanted to do the patch. So they decided to sue Intel and say, why can't you fix this properly? So the claim is that currently you either patch this and have an unusable processor, or you just choose to remain vulnerable. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this case resolves. Maybe they'll send me some new processors and motherboards. And wouldn't that be cool? Like, hey, guess what? Here's a 14th generation processor and a free motherboard. Yeah, I doubt that very seriously, but you never know. An interesting Krebs story was about Experian. And if you don't know Experian, Experian's one of these credit reporting agencies, and we all hate them. They're all, sketchy, in my opinion. They are difficult to deal with, but they affect everything in your life. You ever have a problem with one of these credit reporting agents? I did a long time ago, and it wasn't my fault. They said a guy named Doug White had a Sears credit card in North Carolina and had run up all these unpaid bills. And that was somehow put on my credit report. And it took me literally months of fighting with them, up to and including have attorneys get involved in order to get this removed. It was ruining my credit rating, basically. We tried to get a home loan and we were rejected. I was like, why are we rejected for this? And then I ran my credit and went, oh, I see. And then fighting with Experian was really, really challenging. It was, basically on hold for 4 hours, and then a person goes, uh-huh. And what she told me was, you'll need to prove that you never had this credit card. And I was just literally like, how on earth can I prove that? It's not me. I never lived in North Carolina. I don't know this person. And they were like, well, you'll need to get that person to write a letter to the credit company explaining that they take responsibility for the card. And I'm like, right. I'm going to get this deadbeat guy to write a letter to you. You bet. I even tried calling him, and the guy basically told me to F you and hung up the phone. But anyway, Krebs went through this whole analysis of how Experian accounts can be hijacked. Now, this started with a Krebs story back in 2022, where Krebs said, my account's been hijacked. I want to fix it. And it was a problem with the identity management functions that Experian had, but they didn't fix it. According to Krebs now, it still hasn't been fixed, and Krebs got hijacked again. Now, basically, the story has all the grim details of this, but it appears that anyone can basically hijack these Experian accounts, because basically you could go to Experian, ask to recreate your credit file using an email address that's different from the one on file, and if you have any personal information about the person, they push that in, and then it sends a re-register confirmation to the old email address. So you have to know my email address now. That you don't have to know that. You have to know some personal information, and then that email comes to me, and you'd think that email would be like, verify that you want to change the email address on your account, but that's not what happens. It's already been locked out, and the person has been able to hijack and see your entire credit history, which is not that big of a deal because pretty much anybody can request those reports by, whether legitimately or fraudulently. And there is a link into the old story and all this stuff. But the link basically locks the account, and an email is sent to the old address, but you don't get to approve it. It just changes. And so you can go in and, of course, change it right back, but then they could go in and change it back again, and they already got your information. So one of the steps requires ubiquitous security questions based on public information. You've probably seen these before, and I've used this system. And all the questions were about things you could have looked up about me. So you could have answered these questions based on what are Doug's old addresses, although I couldn't even remember one of them, and I wasn't sure we lived there or not. But regardless, that's pretty problematic. And I've never been a fan of these groups anyway, so I'm obviously a bit biased. But, regardless, I think something's going to have to get done here, because Krebs keeps pointing this out. People keep doing this, and Experian doesn't seem to be willing to fix it. And they probably should. Maybe a class action lawsuit's in order. I don't know. It's worth a read anyway. And you probably have information on Experian, even if you don't know it and didn't approve of it, because they have information on everybody. Well, a firm which was trying to help someone recover a Bitcoin wallet failed in recovering the wallet. They specialize in that, but they found a way to crack other wallets in the process. The information was released on Tuesday and said that the information would mean that you need to move your money if you are actually at risk. The company's called Unciphered, cool name, and has been working for months to try to alert more than 1 million wallet owners that they are at risk. Now, many of these wallets were created at crypto websites that are no longer in business, so they said they were unable to figure out who owns the wallets because the sites don't exist anymore. The flaw is they named it Randstorm because it's based on wallets that were created that use crypto keys that weren't random enough. This sounds like those old, you remember when people used to get the packet numbers and they were able to predict the packet numbers because Windows was really bad at random numbering way back when? Yeah, well, the keys that they normally use for crypto wallets are apparently 1 in a trillion odds for predicting it. But the number on these was 1 in 1,000, which means you're very easy to compromise. So wallets that were made before March 2012 are the easiest ones to crack. And apparently there's about $100 million outstanding in those wallets. So if you have an old wallet that was before 2012, you definitely need to do something about that. Another $50 billion in Bitcoin is stored in wallets that were created between 2012 and the end of 2015. But they said only about 2% of those are vulnerable. You can check for vulnerability, and I did not validate this website, but this was what was in the article. So you may want to validate it before you give them any information. But it was at www.keybleed.com, KEYBLEED.com. Said it would tell you if you're vulnerable. I didn't check the site, so I probably should have, but I ran out of time. But if you're holding Bitcoin or other crypto that is based on Libit coins and old wallets, you probably should be checking that out right now because somebody's going to jump on this and start, scraping up all that money. Well, he travels from town to town, one of the few remaining rat enchanters left in the Midlands. His weapon of choice, an 8-string baliset from which he yodels old love songs from the 1950s that rats seem particularly attracted to, like Teen Angel. His dulcet tones lead the rats out of town, and, well, they kind of go to the next town where he shows up and then asks for more money to get rid of all the rats in the town. And it's actually quite lucrative in a sort of unethical way. But please welcome rat enthusiast Jason Wood.
Hey, Doug, don't knock it. It pays the bills quite well.
You got no criticism here.
There you go. So, there's no shortage of news about high-profile ransomware and extortion over the last week. Doug already talked about the attack against the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China's U.S. business unit, which I heard some reports led to the attackers getting paid. That happened Thursday last week. And then on the next day, Friday, DP World Australia shut down its operations completely of 4 container terminals at ports in Australia from Friday to Monday, and not fully back in gear on Monday, but at least starting some things back up. And then there was also stuff about Boeing being hit by Lockbit, and it's kind of all over the place. Now, while it's never a good thing when China's or the world's largest bank, it depends on which news article you read as to how big this bank was, it appears, gets ransomed and impacts U.S. treasuries, like Doug was talking about. Attacks that disrupt the flow of goods, including things like food and medical supplies into a country, seems like it gets people's attention even more. It becomes a little bit more serious. Though I do have to wonder, if there was a phone call from President Xi Jinping to President Putin about the ICBC attack. Hey, Vladimir, I got a bone to pick with you about one of your criminal groups. If the reports of the payout were true, that had to have been some kind of record, but I'm curious to see if they go a little quiet if the FSB comes by to visit them about this. Anyhow, DP World on Friday is reported to have detected this attack across their operations at 4 separate ports. And in response, they completely disconnected their systems from the internet. And this resulted in a number of things not being able to work. And because of that, they shut down their operations at ports in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Fremantle. And I read at least one report saying that they actually could pull containers off of the ships. What they couldn't do was let them leave the port because those systems to log things and transfer things around weren't working. But I also saw some other reports where they said, some cranes didn't work and some other equipment wouldn't work without internet access, which is kind of frightening. So, I'm not sure what's going on here, but regardless, if they had some unloading capacity, you're going to fill up whatever space you have pretty quickly, since these facilities are really meant to transfer goods, not store them. To give you an idea of the scope of this attack, or the impact of it rather, not really the attack itself, according to the BBC, DP World handles about 40% of the goods that enter or leave Australia. So this is a pretty massive shutdown. Now, as I said, fortunately, it does appear they were able to start up some operations again on Monday, but it's a very small percentage of things they were able to open up. They were able to trace down some really critical supplies like medical goods and stuff like that they needed to get off the docks anyhow, quickly. But it's going to be a while before they get back up to normal capacity because, I mean, you have the workloads you're used to be able to handle every day. They back that up for 3 days or more, actually, since they're at lower capacity. And then now you have to basically process all of that and catch up, and keep up with the new stuff that's coming in. So, yeah, huge impact. I do wonder how many items are not going to be usable at all because of this delay. Particularly when you start talking about food supplies or other goods that are time sensitive. One thing that is a positive, of course, is they were able to get at least some of their capacity going over the weekend. Now, I was a bit surprised about this decision to just disconnect the ports from the internet entirely. My first thought is that, wow, that sounds like a pretty heavy-handed response to the intrusion. But, turning on an internet connection is a lot easier than restoring an entire, infrastructure and stuff like that across 4 entire facilities. So maybe this is going to pay off. I'm actually really kind of curious to see how that works as a response mechanism. I read one article where the Australian government said they fully supported this shutdown, to prevent the attackers from moving around. Basically, by doing this, the idea is we're just going to cut off their remote access entirely just by pulling the plug on the entire thing for a while. So the response is still going on, and I did a bunch of looking around last night to see if I could find out more information than that. Like, what type of ransomware is it? Do we have anything about the intrusion vector? Do we know anything about, who did it? As to what type of group is this? Is it Lockbit? Is it somebody else? And at this point, there is no information about that. How did they get in? Yeah, no idea. The company and Australian authorities are staying very quiet about those aspects of this intrusion. Obviously, the Australian government is closely monitoring the situation, since anything that severs 40% of your trade capacity is bound to get your attention. One of the things that's striking to me about this, and when you talk about the ICBC attack and others, but with these two particular intrusions now, this last week, you have a small group of people who get together to do an attack like this, and they just have a majorly outsized impact on things that are going around in the world. I mean, you're talking about I don't know, let's call it 100 people just for grins. 100 people shut down operations to 4 ports, 40% of a country's shipping capacity from wherever they are. Probably a minimal, presence there in Australia. And, the militaries around the world are protesting and howling in pain because they can't do it that cheaply or easily. Obviously, they can recover back up and stuff like that. But, in the past, to cut off trade like this to a country, you had to have an entire navy out there doing a blockade or something like that, and a lot of expense. And these folks are, able to have just a hugely multiplied effect. So this is a really, some of these stories here get a little bit freaky when you think about how countries might respond to this sort of thing. What's Australia going to do when they figure out, roughly who's behind this? How are they going to react to their lifeline to the world being cut off like this, or at least interrupted for a period of time? How much more serious could it have been had they fully ransomed the environment and locked systems up? And now they don't have the opportunity to recover gracefully over a weekend. To some extent, they're just hosed, and they're having to rebuild the entire infrastructure. That could last quite a bit longer. I know that, obviously this capability, the technical capabilities that we have makes us, much more efficient and makes things much less labor intensive now. But not all that long ago, you didn't need internet access to unload a ship, put stuff on a truck, and ship it on to the warehouses. But such is the world we live in. It's a developing story here. I'm, like I said, very curious to see how this is going to turn out. And with that, let's go back over to Dr. Doug pretty quick. I hear he has a helicopter he's got to catch. Get to class on time.
The Security Weekly chopper in the Security Weekly cave is going to fly me across the bay. So I'm waiting on that. I want maybe it'll be a drone-like thing. So we just sit, yeah.
Get you one of those little personal quadcopters.
Yeah, that's what I'm. Yeah,
size of a car, and just
it just sits out here.
Runs
in the
out of battery in the middle of the bay, and you're like, "Oh,
awesome!"
Oops.
It would take like 5 minutes to get to school if I could fly across the bay. It would really be quick, but I have to drive all the way around. Yeah. Thanks, Jason. And finally, Elon Cybertruck. Well, to me, and beauty's in the eye of the beholder, this is one of the ugliest things I've ever seen to start with. I mean, it just looks awful. But apparently, Tesla is threatening anyone who wants to sell the truck within the first year of purchase. Now, the trucks haven't been released yet. They're supposed to come out at the end of November. Now, if you know what this is, and you may not, a Dumble amplifier was something they sold, and Mr. Dumble made these, and you had to sign all these agreements if you bought one, that you wouldn't do this and you wouldn't do that, and if you did anything that made him mad, he'd come and take it away from you, and on and on and on. This is kind of crazy, but they were supposed to be like the best amps anywhere, and they made a whole bunch of them. But anyway, apparently, Tesla updated the terms and conditions ahead of the debut of the Cybertruck at the end of November and added some restrictions to the new owners. It now says that the company may demand, quote, liquidated damages of $50,000 or the resale price, whichever is greater, if you do an unauthorized Cybertruck resale. What? It goes on to say that by agreeing to purchase the Cybertruck, you agree that you will not sell or otherwise attempt to sell the vehicle within the first year after delivery. You can sell it, but you have to get written permission from Tesla, and Tesla must be given the first right to repurchase the truck at the purchase price listed on your final price sheet, less 25 cents per mile driven, reasonable wear and tear, and the cost to repair any issues. Wow. Then, if Tesla decides they don't want to buy it from you for that deal, you might be free to sell the vehicle. But they did say they reserve the right to not sell vehicles to you any longer. I mean, honestly, do you really want one of these things anyway? I mean, it's been delayed in production for years. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Elon never did send me that Tesla X he promised me in that gas station in Louisiana, but, I mean, whatever. But I would have liked to have a Dumble amp, but on this thing, and it's uglier than a 76 Aston Martin Lagonda. If you've ever seen one of those, one of the ugliest cars ever made, it's absolutely hideous. If you've never seen one, look it up. It's worth looking at. It's so weird. A 76 Aston Martin Lagonda. I mean, yeah, please. Anyway, and that's the news. Thanks, Jason. I'll see you Friday on the Security Weekly News.